My name is Lorraine Whitfield. I am 66 years old, an African-American woman who spent her entire life building a family that I thought would one day return the same care I poured into it. And as I sat in that cold recovery room after the surgeon told me the procedure had gone well, I realized that the person I had trusted most, my only son Daniel, 38 years old, was not the man I had raised him to be. The nurse wheeled me out slowly, the fluorescent lights glaring above me like an interrogation lamp, and I clutched my bag with trembling fingers, my mouth dry from anesthesia, my heart already rehearsing the relief of seeing my boy waiting for me in the lobby. I dialed his number with a heaviness that made each ring echo in my chest, and when his voice finally answered, clipped and impatient, it carried no warmth, only the stale sound of indifference. "I can't, Ma. I'm busy at work," he said, as if the hours of labor and sacrifice that had fed him, clothed him, and carried him through life could be brushed aside with one shallow excuse. I felt the weight of his refusal settle in my stomach like lead, heavier than the stitches holding me together. For a moment I thought I had misheard, that surely he meant he was delayed. But no, his silence afterward confirmed it, a silence that carved a canyon between us. I pressed the phone to my ear, whispering a weak, "All right?" Because what else could I do? Dignity clinging to me like a threadbare coat in the rain. The nurse looked at me with gentle eyes that said she understood more than she let on, and I smiled tightly, masking the humiliation rising inside me. I had been there for Daniel through broken bones, failed romances, and even when he lost his first job and sat on my couch for weeks in despair, it was my hand on his shoulder, my words of encouragement, my prayers whispered into the night. And now, when all I needed was a ride home, he cast me aside like a forgotten appointment. I told myself not to cry, not here, not in front of strangers. But the truth seeped through anyway. Hot tears I quickly brushed away, as if erasing evidence of betrayal. That phone call, short and sharp, was not just a refusal to drive me home. It was the unmasking of years of neglect I had tried to excuse. The moment when a mother's love met the cold reality of a son who no longer saw her as his responsibility. And as I sat waiting for a taxi, groggy and hurting, I felt something inside me break, but also something else stir, quiet and dangerous, like a seed of reckoning beginning to take root. The taxi smelled faintly of peppermint and old leather, and as I lowered myself carefully onto the seat, clutching my stomach where the stitches pulled like tiny knives, I felt the kind of humiliation that seeps deeper than pain, the kind that makes you question your worth in the world. The driver, a man with soft eyes and a gentle voice, glanced at me through the mirror and asked if I was all right, and I nodded quickly, too proud to confess that my son had abandoned me in the sterile lobby of a hospital, as if I were nothing more than a burden to be scheduled around his day. My body still felt heavy with anesthesia, my limbs weak and unsteady, but it was my spirit that ached most as the car pulled away from the curb, carrying me not just away from the building, but away from an illusion I had protected for too long, the illusion that Daniel would one day step into the role of a caring son, the way I had stepped into motherhood, without hesitation. The city blurred outside the window, neon signs bleeding into the night. While inside the cab, the driver offered me a bottle of water, his simple act of compassion cutting me deeper than Daniel's refusal, because it reminded me that strangers could extend more kindness than the boy I had carried in my womb, the boy whose first cries had once been the sound that defined my purpose. I wanted to explain to the driver, to tell him that I had asked only for a ride home. Nothing more, not money or sacrifice, just presence. But the words stuck in my throat, because to say them out loud would have been to admit that I had raised a man who could look at his mother's weakness and turn away. Instead, I whispered, "Thank you," my voice brittle. And he smiled, saying it was no trouble, as if dignity could be restored with a sip of water and a kind word. The ride was short but felt endless. Every turn a reminder of how far I had fallen in Daniel's eyes, reduced from a woman who once balanced 2 jobs to feed him to someone unworthy of a simple detour. When the car stopped at my house, the driver stepped out to open the door for me, his hand steadying my elbow, and that small gesture of care nearly broke me. I pressed money into his palm with shaking fingers, my gratitude spilling out in a quiet blessing he would never know. And as I walked up the steps alone, the weight of my son's absence followed me inside, shadowing every corner of my home like a ghost I could no longer ignore. Lying in bed that night, the pain from my stitches seemed almost merciful compared to the ache pressing against my chest, because Daniel's refusal to drive me home was not an isolated cruelty, but the echo of so many other wounds I had tried to bury beneath forgiveness, each one now rising like ghosts to torment me. I remembered the birthdays he forgot, not once, but year after year, as if the woman who had labored to bring him into this world did not merit a simple phone call, while he posted photographs of himself laughing with friends at restaurants I had never been invited to. I remembered the countless evenings when I would sit by the phone, willing it to ring, only to be met with silence. And when I finally gathered the courage to call him, his voice would come sharp and impatient, asking if I needed something important or if I was just being clingy again. That word, clingy, fell from his mouth like a blade, cutting deeper than he realized. Because I had never clung to anyone in my life, not when I worked 2 jobs to pay the mortgage, not when I stood alone at his father's funeral, not when the world tried to tell me a black woman raising a boy on her own could not possibly succeed. Yet my own son used it as a weapon against me, as though my desire for connection, for simple acknowledgement, made me weak. I remembered the time he moved into his new house and never asked me to come see it, though I had scraped and saved to give him the down payment, and the holidays when I cooked enough food for an army, only to find myself eating alone, sending him messages that remained unanswered. I had told myself he was busy, that his life was demanding, that it wasn't personal, but sitting there with the hospital wristband still tight around my arm, I realized it had always been personal. His refusal after my surgery was not born of circumstance but of choice, a final punctuation mark on years of quiet dismissal. It crystallized everything, hardened it into truth. I could no longer soften with excuses. In that moment, I understood that I was not invisible by accident. I had been pushed into invisibility by the very child I had poured my soul into, and the grief of that knowledge settled over me heavier than any blanket, a grief that whispered, this was not neglect born yesterday, but a pattern long in the making, one I could no longer ignore. When I finally made it through the door of my quiet house, the weight of the day pressed against me like a stone. And as I lowered myself carefully onto the bed, each movement tugging at the stitches across my abdomen, I realized the pain in my body was only a pale reflection of the deeper wound tearing at my heart, a wound carved by Daniel's refusal to be there for me when I needed him most. The silence of the house wrapped itself around me, thick and suffocating, so different from the laughter and warmth I once dreamed would fill these rooms when Daniel was a boy, and I pictured him growing into a man who would never forget where he came from. I thought of the nights I stayed awake nursing him through fevers, the mornings I went without breakfast so he could have lunch money, the years I wore second-hand clothes so he could step into school with pride, and none of it seemed to matter now. Because when I asked for nothing more than a simple ride, he had left me to the mercy of strangers. I tried to breathe slowly, to calm the racing in my chest, but the betrayal clung to me like smoke, seeping into every corner of my being. until the tears came, hot and relentless, sliding into my hairline as I pressed my face into the pillow. These were not the tears of weakness I had shed in my younger years, when I felt the world's judgment pressing on me for raising a child alone. They were the tears of betrayal, of a mother recognizing that the love she gave without condition had not been returned, and perhaps never would be. I whispered his name into the darkness. Daniel, as if saying it aloud might bring back the boy who once clung to my hand crossing the street, the boy who used to fall asleep on my chest, breathing softly against me as though I were the only safe place in the world. But that boy was gone, replaced by a man who saw his mother's need as an inconvenience, a burden too heavy for his pride to carry. The throbbing in my stitches grew sharper, but even that pain was dulled by the heaviness pressing on my chest, the realization that I had given him life, and yet, in the most fragile hour of mine, he had chosen absence. The next morning, the world outside my window seemed indifferent to my pain, the sun climbing as if it had no knowledge of the heaviness pressing on my chest, and I shuffled slowly through the house, each step reminding me of the stitches tugging beneath my skin. When a soft knock at the door startled me from my fog of grief, and there stood Evelyn, my neighbour of many years, her silver hair pulled back neatly, her warm brown eyes filled with the kind of quiet understanding that does not need words. She carried a small pot of chicken soup, steam curling into the morning air like a promise of comfort. And without waiting for permission, she stepped inside, moving through my kitchen as though she had always belonged there, setting the pot on the stove, finding bowls and spoons, as if caring for me was the most natural thing in the world. I watched her with tears stinging the corners of my eyes, because the simple kindness of a woman who owed me nothing cut deeper than the absence of the son I had given everything to. And when she placed a bowl before me, urging me to eat slowly, I felt the ache of betrayal sharpen into something almost unbearable. Evelyn sat with me at the table, her voice calm, her words woven with wisdom that only comes from age and survival, telling me that family is not always written in blood, but often in loyalty, in the small acts of love that show up when the world expects you to stand alone. I wanted to protest, to cling to the belief that Daniel would change, that his refusal to drive me home was a momentary lapse, but her words found a crack in the wall I had built around myself, slipping in and planting a seed of doubt in the faith I had stubbornly reserved for my son. We ate together in silence, spoonfuls of warmth easing the tightness in my throat. And when she reached across the table to rest her hand over mine, the touch was so steady, so deliberate, that I felt a strange mixture of sorrow and relief wash through me. Here was a woman not bound to me by blood or obligation, yet her presence filled the emptiness Daniel had left behind, reminding me that love can be chosen, and sometimes those who are not our kin prove themselves more like family than those we raise with our own flesh and blood. The following weekend, I forced myself to attend a family gathering at Daniel's house, determined not to let the rawness of my wounds keep me from showing up where a mother should be. Though my heart pounded the entire drive there, every mile a reminder of how recently he had turned me away in my moment of need. The living room was crowded with chatter and the scent of roast beef, children running across the carpet, glasses clinking, and for a fleeting moment, I let myself imagine that perhaps Daniel would greet me with warmth, that perhaps my absence from his thoughts during surgery had been nothing but an unfortunate lapse. But when I stepped into the kitchen, I caught him leaning against the counter with Marla, his wife, their heads bent together in laughter that fell silent as soon as they noticed me. Later, when the family gathered around the table, Daniel raised his glass and smirked, saying with a careless chuckle, "Here's to parents who can't do anything without their kids driving them around," his eyes flicking toward me as if daring me to protest. The laughter that followed was not general but sharp, and Marla added to it with her own mocking giggle, her manicured hand brushing against his arm as if she shared in some private joke about my weakness. The words landed harder than any blow. Not because of their cruelty alone, but because they stripped bare the truth I had tried to ignore, that my son no longer saw me as the woman who had once carried him through storms, but as a caricature, a needy parent whose value had expired. I smiled faintly, pressing my napkin to my lips to hide the tremor there, though inside my resolve began to harden like stone cooling in fire. I remembered Evelyn's words about loyalty and choice, and for the first time, I allowed myself to believe them, to consider that perhaps the ties of blood were not sacred if they were soaked in disrespect. I stayed through the meal, answering politely when spoken to, watching the play of shadows across Daniel's face as he entertained others. But in my heart, I was already drawing lines, quiet but firm, knowing that the man I once believed would carry my legacy had chosen to ridicule it instead. That night, as I drove home under the heavy quilt of stars, the memory of his laughter echoed in my ears, and I knew I would never again excuse such cruelty with silence. I sat across from Eleanor in her sunlit living room, the air carrying the faint scent of lavender from the garden outside, and as I nursed a cup of tea she had set before me, I finally let the words I had been holding inside spill into the space between us, telling her about the surgery, the taxi, the cruel joke at Daniel's table, every detail that still scraped raw against me like sandpaper on an old wound. Eleanor, with her silver hair cut close to her head and her calm brown eyes, listened without interruption, her hands folded neatly on her lap, her silence more comforting than any hurried attempt to fix my pain, and when I finally fell quiet, she sighed softly, the kind of sigh that belongs to someone who has spent a lifetime listening to stories just like mine, stories of sacrifice met with indifference, of loyalty dismissed until it was too late. "Lorraine," she said, her voice steady but not unkind, "sometimes love has to be withdrawn before it is ever truly seen." And though the words startled me, they carried a truth I could not deny, a truth that rattled in my bones like a key turning in a lock I had never dared to open. I protested weakly at first, insisting he was my only child, that mothers are meant to give without measure. But Eleanor's gaze never wavered, and she reminded me that giving without boundaries was not love, but servitude, and that Daniel had come to expect my devotion as his birthright, while offering me nothing in return. She leaned back in her chair and told me stories from her years as a lawyer, stories of parents who gave until they had nothing left, only to be discarded, their children circling back only when money and inheritance hung in the balance. Her words carved through my denial, each example another chisel against the idol I had made of Daniel in my heart, and I began to see him not just as my son, but as a man who had chosen to devalue me. Eleanor's advice was simple yet radical: to take hold of the power I still had, to remember that the deeds, the accounts, the will he assumed were his future, were in fact mine to decide, and if I wanted him to truly understand the weight of his neglect, I had to be willing to consider a world where his expectations crumbled. I left her house that day, carrying more than her tea in my veins. I carried the first spark of a plan. Fragile and terrifying, but alive all the same. When I returned home from Eleanor's that evening, her words kept circling in my mind like a hymn I could not forget. And for the first time, I walked through my house, not as a mother, still hoping for scraps of affection, but as a woman who understood the power she had quietly carried all along, tucked into drawers, filing cabinets, and the locked box beneath my bed. The next morning I pulled out folders that had sat untouched for years, dust rising as I laid them across the dining table, the sunlight spilling through the curtains, illuminating each page like a revelation. There were property deeds with my name printed clearly in bold, the small house I had paid off with sweat and long nights at the sewing machine, savings accounts that had grown slowly but steadily through decades of careful sacrifice, and the will that Daniel no doubt believed was written in stone, his inheritance assured simply because he was my only child. My hands trembled as I flipped through the papers, not from weakness, but from the sudden awareness that I was not powerless, that while he had mocked me for being needy, it was he who had built his future on the assumption of my generosity. I thought of the times he had dismissed me, brushing aside my calls as if they were interruptions, mocking me at his table, refusing to drive me home when I could barely walk, and I realized that he had done so with the arrogance of someone convinced that no matter how he treated me, the day would come when he would benefit from all I had worked for. That belief had emboldened him, made him careless, and yet, as I stared at the documents spread before me, I felt a strange strength rising inside, like a river long dammed finally breaking free. I could choose differently. I could decide that my sacrifices would not become his reward, not when he had turned his back on me, when it mattered most. The power lay not in confrontation or raised voices, but in quiet decisions made with a pen, in signatures that could reroute the future he believed was secure. For the first time in years, I felt the balance shift. The scales no longer tipped against me but waiting for my hand, and I sat at the table in the hush of my home, realizing that Daniel had underestimated me, that he had mistaken love for weakness, and that mistake would change everything. I decided to test the waters before moving forward, to see whether Daniel's heart held even a sliver of the son I once knew. So one afternoon, I picked up the phone and called him, my voice careful, asking if he might come by the house to help me with a leaking tap in the kitchen, a small favor, nothing that would take more than half an hour of his time, but important to me. Since the steady drip, drip, drip had been wearing on my nerves, and my body still ached from surgery, I tried to sound casual, not desperate, even though asking him felt like swallowing glass, because I knew in my bones what the answer would be, but part of me still hoped for surprise. His response came sharp, almost rehearsed, with a sigh that carried impatience more than concern. "I can't, Ma. I'm swamped. Just call a plumber," he said, as though money grew on trees in my backyard, as though the point had not been the repair but his presence, his willingness to put me above his schedule for once. I thanked him quickly before he could hear the quiver in my voice, then set the phone down on the counter, staring at the wall as the sound of the dripping tap seemed to grow louder, more mocking with each fall of water into the sink. It was not about the faucet, and it never had been. It was about whether Daniel could rise above his self-absorption long enough to care, and his refusal was the final answer to a question I had carried for years. My hands trembled not with weakness but with the confirmation of what I already knew deep inside, that his priorities had no space for me, that I was not mother but nuisance, not foundation but inconvenience. I sat at the table, the papers I had gathered from my filing cabinet still stacked neatly at one end, and I felt the scales tip in my mind, the last shred of doubt dissolving like sugar in boiling water. Daniel had made his choice, and I would make mine. As the tap dripped steadily into the silence of the kitchen, I found myself whispering aloud, "Never again," not in sorrow but in resolve, because in that moment I knew with certainty that the boy I had raised was gone, and the man he had become would never value me until I took away the things he believed he already owned. The day I returned to Eleanor's house with the neat stack of documents pressed against my chest, the air felt heavier, as if the world itself understood the weight of what I was about to do, and when she opened the door and ushered me inside, her calm presence steadied me enough to place the papers on her oak table and admit aloud what had been growing inside me for weeks. that Daniel would no longer inherit by default the fruits of my labor, that my sacrifices would not feed his arrogance. Eleanor listened quietly as I explained, her lawyer's mind already moving ahead of me, and she spread the documents across the table with the precision of a surgeon, pointing out clauses, suggesting revisions, guiding my pen as I rewrote the future my son had always assumed was his. I thought of the house, its walls that had sheltered him through storms and laughter, now destined to serve another purpose, the savings accounts I had built penny by penny while patching together 2 jobs, now redirected to scholarships for children who needed a chance, and even the life insurance he believed would secure his comfort, now carved into portions that would nurture my grandchildren's education, ensuring their futures did not depend on his carelessness. I remembered Evelyn standing in my kitchen with soup, her steady hand covering mine, her loyalty unquestioned in the face of my weakness, and it felt right to include her too, to recognize that family can be chosen, that bonds forged in kindness are stronger than the brittle ties of blood when those ties are frayed by cruelty. Each signature I pressed into the page felt like both a betrayal and a liberation, the ink flowing with the memories of Daniel's mockery, his refusals, his cold laughter, until the paper itself seemed to pulse with justice. Eleanor looked at me when it was done, her eyes reflecting not triumph but solidarity, and she told me that what I had chosen was not revenge, but reclamation, that I was simply taking back the dignity he had tried to strip from me. I sat back in the chair, my chest rising and falling with the rhythm of release, and for the first time in years I felt not powerless, but protected, as though a fortress had been quietly built around me, brick by brick, with the mortar of resolve. Daniel still believed his future was secure, but the truth now rested in my hands, and it was mine alone. The night of the dinner, I walked into Daniel's house with a calmness that felt foreign to me, the kind of calm that comes not from peace, but from certainty. And as I settled into my seat at the long oak table, surrounded by chatter and the clinking of glasses, I watched my son hold court at the head, as though he were already master of an empire that did not belong to him. His voice rose above the others, smooth with confidence, and he leaned back with that smug smile he had perfected over the years, bragging about the beach house he planned to renovate once it was his, describing paint colors and landscaping choices, as though the place had already passed into his possession. The others chuckled politely, some nodding along, but my stomach tightened with every careless word, each one another reminder of how deeply he believed my sacrifices existed only to line his future. I let him continue, let him spin his little fantasies, until the silence between bites settled long enough for me to speak, my voice steady, cutting through the hum of conversation like a bell tolling. "Daniel," I said, and the weight in my tone made him glance at me. Half amused, half annoyed, "That beach house you're talking about will never be yours. None of it will." For a heartbeat the table went still, and then he laughed, a sharp, dismissive laugh that carried no fear, because he thought he knew me too well, thought I was bluffing. The same mother who had always bent under the weight of his demands. But I did not falter, did not soften. Instead, I reached into my bag and laid the stack of signed documents on the table, sliding them toward him with deliberate care. His laughter faltered as his eyes flicked over the signatures. The seals, the clear words that stripped away the illusions he had wrapped himself in, and color rose sharply in his face. The silence that followed was louder than any argument, the kind of silence that grips a room when truth arrives like a thunderclap. I held his gaze, my hands folded neatly in my lap, and said nothing more, because the document spoke louder than any speech, and in that moment, I saw the certainty in his eyes crumble into disbelief. The ground of entitlement finally shifting beneath him, Daniel's face twisted as he shoved the papers back across the table, his voice rising with a fury that rattled the glasses and stilled every conversation around us, accusing me of betrayal, of cruelty, of being an ungrateful mother who had forgotten all he had supposedly done for me. Though his list of sacrifices was empty air, a performance meant to mask the truth, written plainly in the ink before him. He stood, his chair scraping loudly against the floor, his words tumbling out like arrows tipped with poison, shouting that I owed him, that after all these years I had no right to cut him out, that I was destroying our family with selfishness. I sat quietly, my hands folded in my lap, feeling the storm whip around me like wind against a rooted tree. And though my chest ached with the weight of his words, I found no fear there, only a strange, resolute calm. Because I had lived too long in the shadow of his indifference, to be shaken by his anger now. Marla tried to soothe him, placing a hand on his arm. But he shook her off, his voice cracking as he called me a bitter old woman, a mother too blind to appreciate a son who had built his own life. I let him rage, let him claw at the walls of the reality he had built for himself, until his words burned out into heavy silence, and then I lifted my head and met his eyes with all the steadiness I had carried through decades of sacrifice. "I needed you once," I said, my voice firm but quiet, the kind of quiet that carries truth like iron, "and you weren't there. Don't expect me to be here for you." The words fell between us like a verdict, final and unshakable, and I watched the anger in his face falter, replaced by something raw and frightened, as though he had glimpsed for the first time that the world no longer bent to his assumptions. Around the table, no one spoke, the weight of my words echoing in the silence, and I realized then that I had not only stripped him of his imagined inheritance, but also reclaimed my dignity, the dignity he had chipped at for years with his laughter and refusals. I rose from my chair slowly, my body still healing but my spirit unbroken, and walked out into the night, leaving Daniel standing amid the ruins of his entitlement. In the weeks that followed that dinner, the shock of my decision rippled through the family like a stone cast into still water, the waves reaching cousins, aunts, and even distant relatives I had not spoken to in years. And suddenly, I was no longer simply Lorraine, but a woman, to be judged, dissected, and whispered about. Some called me cruel, their voices sharp over the phone or in letters that arrived, folded too neatly, accusing me of destroying the bond between mother and son, telling me that a mother's duty was to forgive endlessly, no matter the cost, as if sacrifice had no bottom, as if love meant swallowing disrespect until nothing remained of myself. Others, though, reached out quietly, in hushed tones and secret messages, women mostly, who said they admired me, who confessed that they too had children who took them for granted, but lacked the courage to act. And in their words, I felt the tremor of a solidarity not often spoken aloud. Daniel, meanwhile, grew silent, withdrawing from gatherings, ignoring calls, his pride wounded, and his imagined future crumbling in the light of truth. And I heard from neighbors that he no longer boasted about the beach house or the inheritance, that his laughter had dimmed into something brittle. I wondered sometimes if he sat in his own house replaying my words, realizing for the first time that his entitlement had been nothing more than a fragile shell, that the foundation he believed would always support him had shifted beneath his feet. For years I had lived with the shame of his dismissals, of his sharp words and refusals. But now it was he who carried humiliation like a heavy coat he could not take off. And I felt no guilt in watching him wear it, because it was not stitched by me, but by his own actions. Families can fracture in silence or in storms, and ours fractured in both, with some walking away from me altogether, and others drawing nearer. Yet through it all I felt lighter, no longer bound to the hope that Daniel would change, no longer tethered to the illusions that had kept me captive. The fallout was painful, but it was also cleansing, a fire that burned away the dead branches, so something new might one day grow. And though Daniel kept his distance, I knew the silence between us now carried a truth too loud to ignore. In the months that followed, I began to pour my time and energy into places where it was welcomed, into people who understood that love was not a birthright, but a bond nurtured with care. And slowly I built around myself a family of choice, a circle woven not by blood, but by respect and reciprocity. I joined Evelyn at church luncheons, where I met young mothers struggling to balance work and children, and I found myself slipping them envelopes quietly, money pulled from the savings I once guarded for Daniel's future, watching the relief bloom in their eyes like spring flowers. I funded small scholarships through the community centre, nothing grand but enough to cover books or a semester's tuition, and each time I saw a young student's face light up, I felt more pride than I had in years, because my sacrifices were finally feeding futures that would grow strong, rather than entitlement that only hollowed out character. I began mentoring younger women too, women who came to me with stories of children who dismissed them, partners who neglected them, and I offered not only advice but presence, showing them through my own story that strength does not always mean clinging tighter. Sometimes it means letting go. My home, once heavy with silence and the echo of unanswered calls, began to fill again with laughter, with voices around the table, with Evelyn's steady company, and the footsteps of people who valued me not for what they assumed I owed them, but for the love I chose to give freely. It was not the family I had once dreamed of, the one built around Daniel's devotion and grandchildren climbing into my lap, but it was a family nonetheless, and in many ways a truer one, because every person in that circle was there by choice. And I was there by choice too. I discovered that giving without expectation was not weakness when it was directed toward those who reciprocated. And I learned that motherhood could take many shapes, that nurturing did not end when blood ties faltered, but continued wherever it found fertile ground. Looking back, I realized that Daniel's refusal had been both a breaking and a birth, the end of one dream but the beginning of another. And as I stood among my new family, I felt lighter, freer, as though the chains of disappointment had finally fallen away, leaving me with love that was real and lasting. Years later, as I sat behind the wheel of my own car, the afternoon sun slanting across the windshield and the hum of the engine steady beneath me, I found myself thinking back to that day of the surgery, to the sterile smell of disinfectant, the fog of anesthesia, and the phone pressed against my ear when Daniel told me he was too busy to drive me home. Words that shattered something inside me at the time, but which I now understood, had also freed me. The road stretched ahead like a ribbon of possibility, and with each mile, I felt the steady rhythm of my heartbeat, as a reminder that I had endured, that I had not only survived betrayal, but had built something new from its ashes. I remembered the humiliation of climbing into that taxi, the ache of my stitches pulling with every breath, the tears I had tried to hide, and I thought of how those moments had once defined me, a mother cast aside, a woman invisible to her only child, but no longer. I had rebuilt myself in the years that followed, brick by brick, not with Daniel's help, but in spite of his absence, pouring love into my community, into Evelyn, into the women I mentored and the young people I supported, finding in them a family that gave back rather than drained. The woman driving now was not the one who had sat trembling in that hospital lobby, waiting for a son who would never come, but a woman who understood her worth, who no longer measured herself by who had abandoned her, but by the strength it took to reclaim dignity and carry it proudly. I slowed at a red light and caught my reflection in the rearview mirror. The lines on my face etched deep by years of both sorrow and resilience. And I smiled at the woman looking back at me, because she was not broken, she was tempered, like steel forged in fire. The light changed, and I pressed my foot on the gas, the car rolling forward with the quiet grace of certainty, and I whispered a prayer of gratitude, not for Daniel's cruelty, but for the way it had stripped illusions from me, forcing me to see that freedom sometimes arrives in the shape of heartbreak. I was driving myself home now, not just from a checkup, but from a lifetime of waiting, carrying with me the knowledge that I had finally arrived where I was always meant to be.